Do you enjoy flying in an airplane and being reasonably certain that it won't plummet out of the sky? Well, say goodbye to that peace of mind.
As an attorney, it's actually worse than you think.
It is the biggest power grab that the Supreme Court has made since 1805.
The internet freaks out over the Supreme Court for no reason. A TikToker says that cleanliness is now an alt-right value, and I react to your comments. All this and so much more is coming up on today's episode of Brad vs. Everyone, my daily podcast where I take on the craziest ideas from across our politics and across the internet from a center-right, independent perspective. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and sticking around. We don't bite. We just crossed 130,000 subscribers, which is so awesome. And if you're a returning viewer, you already know what I'm gonna say. Don't forget to hit that like button and do comment with your thoughts as we go along. I do read the comments and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. Now, before we get into today's show, I have to start with a mea culpa. A big correction. Yesterday, we reacted to a video of a young girl on TikTok explaining all the young people's latest slang and trying to keep up with it. And I mistakenly referred to her as Gen Z, but she's actually Gen Alpha. So the yacht, skibbity, phantom tax thing is not actually Gen Z's fault, y'all. I apologize to my generation for defaming and libeling us so terribly, and am happy to correct the record. Now, on to our main story for the day. I'm bringing you this news a couple days late because I took some time to thoroughly research the topic, but the Supreme Court just made a seismic decision overturning something called the Chevron doctrine that impacts regulations and the administrative state in America. And in response, left-wing TikTok has lost its ever-loving mind. Let me just give some context for this conversation. We're supposed to have a very clear separation of powers in America. Congress writes the laws. The executive branch, which includes the president and all the federal agencies, enforces the laws. And the judicial branch interprets the laws and settles disputes about their constitutionality, scope, and meaning. But under a 1984 Supreme Court precedent known as the Chevron case, things have worked quite differently in this country. Rather than the judicial system deciding what federal laws mean when they are unclear or ambiguous, under that precedent, they were required to defer to the interpretations of federal agencies. Basically, the executive branch got to decide what rules bound the executive branch. And judges couldn't intervene unless their interpretation was totally unreasonable, even if it wasn't the interpretation that that judge and that court system would have thought was correct and proper. Yet all that just changed because the Supreme Court just overruled the Chevron doctrine in a massive case. In response, left-wing media and social media activists have gone insane and issued some of the most hyperbolic and alarmist doomsday rhetoric I've seen since the net neutrality debate, honestly. Now I'm going to play you guys a compilation of massively viral TikToks that are genuinely detached from reality and issuing really over-the-top, panicked, and alarmist warnings about how the sky is going to fall, in some cases, literally, because of this ruling. Take a listen.
How will the Supreme Court's horrifying and terrible decision to overturn Chevron deference today impact you? Well, here's a few ways. Number 1. Do you enjoy flying in an airplane and being reasonably certain that it won't plummet out of the sky, killing you and everyone else aboard? Well, say goodbye to that peace of mind, because the Supreme Court is now in charge of the Transportation Administration. Number 2, do you enjoy being able to go to a restaurant and in most cases be reasonably certain that they won't kill you with the food they serve? Well, say goodbye to that, because the Supreme Court is now in charge of the FDA. Do you enjoy having relatively clean air and relatively clean water that also won't kill you? Well, the Supreme Court is now in charge of the EPA, so wave goodbye to that as well.
Everyone, I want you to know that if you're freaking out about Chevron being overturned, as an attorney, it's actually worse than you think. It's bad. It's really, really bad. And basically, the way that it's worked in the last 40 years is this. Congress will pass a law, right? But sometimes that law is not exactly clear. And regulatory agencies are given authority to interpret that law on behalf of Congress. So, for example, let's say Congress passes a law and all it says is don't put bad shit in drinking water. Well, a regulatory agency would then have to decide what shit is bad for drinking water. They might say, well, putting more water into the drinking water isn't such a bad thing, but putting asbestos into the drinking water is. And if you do that, we're going to fine you and make sure you never do that again. The problem is, and I want to be very clear about this, companies want nothing more than to put asbestos in your drinking water. They would do it while dancing a little jig if it allowed them to save $1.50.
Ring the alarm. Sound it, please. You thought last night's debate was bad? This morning, the Supreme Court said, let's make it 5,000 times worse. The ruling they just issued, which will probably get not even a lot of coverage in the press because they don't even understand the absolutely devastating long arm impact of it, okay, is so insane. It is the biggest power grab that the Supreme Court has made since 1805. I'm not kidding.
So now I'm going to give you guys my take. And first and foremost, the hysteria and backlash to this decision is unwarranted to me because all the Supreme Court is really doing is restoring the proper order of our constitutional republic and the appropriate separation of powers. Again, Congress is supposed to write the laws, the executive branch is supposed to enforce the laws, and the judicial branch is supposed to interpret the laws. But under Chevron, the executive branch got to execute and enforce the laws, and also was entitled to deference about their own interpretation about what the rules binding their own power and limiting their authority actually mean. That's totally dysfunctional and ripe for abuse. The whole point of the separation of powers is that the branches are kept in check by the other branches, not that they have the power to decide the limits of their own authority. A great example of why this is a disastrous system ripe for abuse is what the CDC did during the COVID-19 pandemic. They instituted unilaterally, through regulatory fiat, a nationwide eviction moratorium, preventing landlords in most circumstances from evicting non-paying tenants, essentially commandeering the properties of landlords nationwide. And they did it all by citing one vague law from the federal books that says the CDC director may, quote, take such measures to prevent such spread of diseases as he or she deems reasonably necessary, including inspection, fumigation, disinfection, sanitation, pest extermination, and destruction of animals or articles believed to be sources of infection. As the constitutional law professor and Cato scholar Josh Blackman wrote at the time, all of these measures are localized and limited to prevent the spread of an infection in a single building or location. None of these examples are remotely close to a nationwide eviction moratorium. This action is far beyond the scope of delegated authority. That's right. The CDC took an old law that authorized the director to order fumigations or close specific businesses and stretched that into somehow giving them authority to commandeer nationwide rental properties. But yeah, we can totally trust federal agencies to interpret the laws that extend to the extent of their power. What could possibly go wrong? And I want to touch on this notion that this is a power grab. In a sense, this decision does reassert the power of the judiciary branch and roll back some of the power of the executive branch. But to call it a power grab implies that it's unwarranted or beyond the scope of what is appropriate. Yet it's not really doing that. It's restoring the proper separation of powers. So it's more like reclaiming power that the Constitution and our republic is supposed to vest in the judicial branch, that executive agencies have hijacked for themselves as part of our out-of-control, ever-growing administrative state. The real power grab was on behalf of the executive agencies, which the Supreme Court permitted with the Chevron case, and this is more like a power reclaiming. And again, it's not really a power grab when it's the power they're supposed to have. The judges are supposed to interpret laws. This is Civics and Constitution 101. And the alarmism about how all our food is going to be poisoned and how planes are going to fall out of the sky and all this stuff has no basis in reality. This affects new regulations, doesn't wipe all the existing ones off the books. And we didn't have Chevron deference before 1984. And it's not like in 1983 we had planes falling out of the sky, poisoned food and water, and then they passed Chevron deference, and in 1985 everything was perfect and rosy. Like, it's just, there's no reality to this scaremongering. Side note, we do need basic environmental and safety regulations to stop companies from cutting corners or emitting huge externalities and like dumping pollution in a river or that kind of thing. But the idea that companies actively want to poison people is kind of absurd. Like, it's not great for a company's bottom line if its customers are dead. And as soon as their blame was brought to the public, they would have a massive media scandal and face tremendous backlash and loss in value. So while yes, we do need basic regulations to stop companies from taking shortcuts in places where they could maybe get away with it without being properly blamed, there's something inherently ridiculous about the worldview that suggests that companies are actively trying to poison and kill their own customers. Like, babe, put down the crack pipe. You've had enough. Anyway, this whole TikTok interpretation of Chevron being overturned is just fundamentally incorrect. They're making it sound like Congress is no longer able to delegate things to experts in the executive branch and let them fill in the blanks. That's not true. Congress can still pass a law that says the EPA shall ban whatever toxins it thinks are harmful to the water supply, and that is up to their interpretation. This only applies when the laws are unclear and vague. If Congress clearly delegates in the law certain authorities to the regulatory agencies, that's not affected by this ruling. It's when there's an ambiguous federal law and the executive agencies interpret it in a way that gives them more power and more authority, well, they can still do that. But now it can be challenged in court, and the courts don't have to just defer to their interpretation of the limits of their own power. That is a good thing. If you're at all concerned with preserving individual freedom and economic enterprise from ever excessive and ever expanding infringements of the administrative state, or if you're just concerned with the proper functioning of our constitutional order and our government within the originally conceived of and thought of constraints known as the separation of powers. And what's particularly bizarre about this left-wing backlash is that these same people are constantly complaining and worried about President Trump potentially becoming a dictator and authoritarian in a hypothetical second term. But this Supreme Court ruling makes the executive less imperial, less powerful, less able to force through new policies or create new laws out of thin air without elected representatives passing new bills. So if you're worried about a dictator or an imperial presidency, why are you also up in arms over a decision that limits the scope of executive authority? The math isn't mathing. In fact, you see a lot of left-wing panic about Project 2025, which I will get into at some point. It's essentially a conservative agenda that various outside groups have outlined that they want a hypothetical 2.0 Trump administration to enact. But guess what, babes? This decision will make it a lot harder for a hypothetical future Trump administration to enact Project 2025 without congressional buy-in and passing laws. Ironically, the crowd that constantly talks about democracy and save democracy are the same people upset about this decision. But this decision takes power away from unelected bureaucrats who nobody voted for getting to make new laws. And it restores that power of lawmaking to Congress, the elected branch of our government that is supposed to have the legislative power. It is, in effect, a pro-democracy ruling that limits the executive branch and limits the threat of an imperial presidency. Yet the same people who are panicked about the future of democracy and the rise of a dictator president are also against this decision. It makes absolutely no sense, but I guess that's kind of par for the course for left-wing media discourse and online social media spaces like TikTok. I have one final thing that I'll say about this, and then I'll open the floor to you guys for your thoughts in the comments. This saga reminds me a lot of the insane panic that we heard when net neutrality was repealed by the Trump administration. We were told this would be the end of the internet as we know it. Things would never be the same. We'd get charged word by word by internet companies. all this crazy stuff. None of it came true whatsoever. And while I think this decision is, in fact, significantly more consequential than the net neutrality change, the progressive panic will similarly go down in history as alarmism, totally untethered from reality, simply meant to scare the public and fear-mongering them into supporting one side of the aisle. And if you ask me, that kind of fear-mongering poses a far bigger threat to our country than restoring the separation of powers. And now, it's time for Brad versus TikTok, my segment where I take on the craziest ideas from across the clock app.
Pronoun of the day is slug slugs.
Make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet, and don't forget to hit that like button to reward my suffering. I'm over here losing brain cells for your entertainment, so the least you can do is hit the like button. And now, let's hear from a young woman who thinks that cleanliness as a value is alt-right? You can't make this stuff up, so let's hear it right from this TikToker herself.
I'm seeing more and more Black women subscribe to trad life, and it's completely fine if you want to do the aesthetic or even the lifestyle, but you have to be careful because it can lead to where? The far right. Baby, there is a pipeline. See, when you look at trad life and soft girl life, there's a cleanliness aspect to it. So many researchers throughout the years have shown a link between cleanliness and things like neo-Nazism, the alt-right, the far-right in general. What are Black women expected to be and usually, praise ourselves about? Our cleanliness. Hitler bathed 4 times a day.
Hitler
He also was a big pusher of willpower. And yes, having willpower is good until it turns into ableism and shaming of people who are in disabled and or different bodies. And Black women always praise ourselves on our willpower because we're forced to have willpower in this f***ed world that treats us the way that it does. Then you see the country songs mixing with the rap song. And though I think that Sexy Red and whoever is allowed to do whatever they want to, it's intentional. You cannot tell me that this rap country crossover mixed in with the fact that we still have Trump, okay, we still have MAGA culture. And a lot of experts will tell you that Trump just gave a conservative unity. Okay, they were all scattered over the place. Trump gave them unity. Trump gave them direction. As you continue to discover yourself and separate yourself from what this society has put on you as a Black woman, be very conscientious of the paths and the roads that you're going down because they might lead somewhere you don't want them to, okay, honey?
Y'all, I'm used to seeing brain rot on TikTok, but even this one still surprised me. Did she seriously just suggest that cleanliness puts you on a path towards the alt-right? Because, babe, declaring cleanliness a right-wing value is kind of the biggest self-own I've ever seen a leftist engage in. Like, call me crazy, but I was hoping that all people, regardless of their politics, valued cleanliness and wearing deodorant and keeping your house in order and making your bed and just taking pride in your life and showing that value of respecting yourself and your environment. That seems to me like it shouldn't be a political thing. And I think you're incorrect to suggest that it really is for most people. But to the extent that what you're saying is true, it's a self-own, babe. It's a self-report. And anytime somebody invokes Hitler, and right-wing people do this too, there's like a 95% chance they're about to say something absurd and dumb. Hitler bathed 4 times a day. I have no idea whether that's true or not, but it's so irrelevant. So is bathing bad now? Hitler also drank water. Should we not drink water? Like, what's your point? And framing willpower as a bad thing? No, it's actually really good. And of course, it doesn't mean you should judge people who literally can't do things, who are disabled. I agree with that, but that's not what willpower is. That's not what valuing willpower is. Obviously, somebody who's in a wheelchair isn't unable to walk because they lack the willpower, but that's very different than valuing willpower as a concept as applied to people, for example, who maybe need to go to the gym more or need to make changes in their diet and aren't doing what's best for their health, and it's showing with their outcomes. Like, that's totally different than being ableist towards people who are genuinely disabled. That has nothing to do with willpower. And it's crazy to me how regressive your thinking must actually be as a supposed social justice warrior, progressive, or whatever this person would call themselves, to think that music and cultures mixing, like rap and country or hip hop and country, is a bad thing. Like, no. That's actually a sign of progress, of groups coming closer together, of groups bonding and spreading across the boundaries of these arbitrary things that shouldn't divide us, like skin color. And yet you somehow see that as bad, or somehow going to trick Black women into becoming secret neo-Nazis or something. Not only does that have like a conspiratorial assumption that all these people who like country music are far right or something, when a lot of them I think are just normal patriotic Americans who maybe aren't super woke, but they're not alt-right. It also has a very low opinion of Black women, as if they can just be brainwashed by music and they're just extremely easy to manipulate and influence, that if they start following trad wife influencers or become a homemaker, next thing you know, they're going to be zipping up their white hoods and going to hang out with Nick Fuentes. Like, babe, no. My takeaway from this video is that this individual is simultaneously incredibly delulu and remarkably pessimistic and condescending to the very same group they think they're helping. So once again, I am just begging woke people on the internet to stop helping minorities. You've lost the plot, and you are officially doing far more harm than good. But what do you think? Do you agree that cleanliness is an alt-right value? And also, do you not see a boy who cried wolf effect here? If you call everything under the sun alt-right or racist, those words lose their power and their meaning. And that hurts our ability to actually call out despicable, vile, hateful people, the Nick Fuenteses of the world, when they do exist. So do you guys agree with me? Do you see this as harmful in the boy who cried wolf kind of way? Or am I missing something, honestly? Let me know in the comments. I do want to hear from you, because this TikTok threw me for a loop, and I've seen a lot on that app in my day. Even this one still had me shook. And now I'll wrap up today's show by reading a few of your comments you left on yesterday's episode. They were more social and spent more time outside. They're homeless. They spend all their time outside. This is in reference to the study about how giving homeless people free money supposedly helped them achieve better outcomes, the homeless people that were given the money, but that wasn't actually true when we looked into it. And honestly, you have a good point. They're touting something as one of their data points that doesn't seem to make much sense. Another person says, Brad, it's hard to focus on your talking points when you have eyebrows that King Tutankhamun would have framed in gold, etched into marble stone, and worshipped like God Horus. I don't really know what that means, but I will take the compliment. So thank you, my friend. Another person writes, as a 63-year-old gay guy who fought for our rights, I'm ashamed of the modern pride movement, and my warning is coming to fruition. The world will turn against the community, and then the crying will reverberate from the modern demand everything gang. We old gays just wanted equality. Yeah, I do feel bad for all the older gays out there who fought for assimilation, who really did just want to fit in and live life and be free, that now they're lumped in with all this crazy insanity that's actively sabotaging our progress. It's infuriating for me. And I wasn't alive during that era. I didn't sacrifice and put my life on the line to fight for equality and acceptance. So I can only imagine how much exponentially more maddening and frustrating it must be for those of you that did. But do know, I appreciate you. I appreciate the work you did. And not all of us are like that. And gosh, I'm really sorry, man. Another person says, my big problem is with the parents that bring children to these parades. So your point is taken. I would not bring my kid to a pride parade knowing the stuff I've seen from them. And I do judge the parents for not immediately taking their kids and leaving when they see some of the stuff. But in slight fairness to the parents, some of these events are advertised as family friendly. So I could see why they'd see a flyer or something and think it's okay to bring their kid to it. Your point is taken, though. Another person said, I actually read the article on the Denver study a week or so ago. I thought it was good news, but thanks for explaining it. Obviously, it's a waste of money if they had the same outcome as the control group. Those journalists should be ashamed of themselves. It was super misleading, straight up lying, really. Yeah, especially when it's these sites that are just like content mills that just churn out articles and they have to do so many articles per day, like a Business Insider. You should be pretty wary of just taking at face value whatever they're regurgitating. And I don't think it's lying on part of the journalist. I think it's just like a combination of being rushed and having to meet content deadlines and laziness and just like not investigating things or being critical or scrutinizing them enough. I don't think they're knowingly publishing something that's not true, at least not in most cases. I think it's more a dereliction of duty, a neglect kind of situation that leads to this kind of misleading, borderline fake news being published. Another person writes, Toronto, Ontario, Canada is not overseas. Yeah, I realized that while editing that I said overseas. I just meant abroad. I just meant outside of the country. Oops. Another person says, Brad, I would skibbity riz or even phantom tax your Ohio yacht, giving stigma or even Rizzler vibes. Oh, I have no idea what that means, but now I feel slightly unsafe. Another person wrote, that thumbnail gave me climate change. I love that comment, and I think I'm gonna start saying that when I see some like Delulu shit on TikTok or something. I'll be like, bruh, that gave me climate change.
How dare you?
So thank you for the inspiration. Another person says, do you have any thoughts on the Supreme Court's opinion in Trump v. United States? I'm quite anxious about its implications, given the increasingly authoritarian tendencies of both major parties. Yes, I do. I think it's a really complicated case. I've been listening to some analysis about it by legal minds I respect, and I can understand both sides of the complicated legal argument about whether a president should have criminal immunity for official acts taken as president. Because if they don't, it's problematic in the sense that what if Congress passes a law saying it is a crime to issue a pardon, but the Constitution explicitly says that the president has the right to pardon people. So obviously some criminality of official acts can't be allowed. But also, what if they order a drone strike, which is an official act, that is unwarranted and kills civilians and is a war crime? Shouldn't they be able to be prosecuted for that? I would certainly hope so. I don't want them to be above the law. So I don't really know the answers. I think it's incredibly complicated, and I will be thinking about it more and looking more into that case. Another person writes, center-right is code for one supports left-leaning viewpoints. So here's the thing. I definitely do not think I'm a left-leaning person or that my overall philosophy is anywhere on the left, but I do have individual opinions that agree with liberals or progressives on some things or are left-leaning on that issue, and that doesn't make me wrong. In fact, if it's you who thinks one side is right 100% of the time, you're probably the one who is oversimplifying things and not thinking them through clearly. All right, everybody, that is it for today's episode of Brad vs. Everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to hit that like button before you go. Make sure you're subscribed if you haven't yet. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, which guys, you can do, I'm on there as well, don't forget to rate and review the show. It really helps us grow. And comment with your thoughts if you're watching us on YouTube. I do read the comments and I'll pick a few to respond to in tomorrow's episode. And with that, we'll talk again tomorrow.